Nimitz and Spruance had made their decision. The Marines would have to take Iwo Jima's beaches and the island with whatever the Navy could provide. General Smith anticipated the usual accusations of wasting lives and would carry to his grave the bitter realization that 10 days of shelling and more carrier-based heavy armament use before D-Day could have saved thousands of Marines. Nimitz called 2 more planning sessions, and there was a sliver of good news for the Marines. The Joint Chiefs pushed back Iwo Jima's D-Day by 1 month. However, this decision was final. There would be no further delays. The invasion was set for February 19, 1945. Once started, an invasion is like an avalanche, it must run its course. Now, it was up to the Marines to take the island the hard way, with riflemen, tanks, and artillery, battling pillbox by pillbox, bunker by bunker in close combat. The ultimate weapon would be a young man with a bayoneted rifle. Major General Julian C. Smith, who had commanded the 2nd Division at Tarawa, highlighted the gravity of the situation during a turbulent session. "Even though you Navy officers do come within about 1,000 yards, he said, I remind you that you have a little more armor. I want you to know that Marines are crossing the beach with bayonets, and the only armor they will have is a khaki shirt." Troops had been training for months for Iwo Jima. For them, life was monotonous, grueling, and repetitive. Rigorous training for combat, then invasion of another island, followed by more training and another invasion. Unlike in Europe, where Americans liberated cities and countries and enjoyed the rewards of conquering heroes, the Pacific theater told a different, sadder story. Liberty was almost unheard of, with little to do, nowhere to go, and nothing to see on remote, disease-infested jungle islands where the Marines had their base camps. Entertainment consisted of nightly outdoor movies, rain or shine, with the same films repeated so often that bored viewers recited the dialogue word for word. If a United Service Organization USO show came, it was second-rate. The pattern remained the same, unless one was wounded and flown stateside for hospitalization and treatment. After recuperation in 30 days, they would most likely be sent back to the Pacific for more combat, unless their wounds were severe enough for them to be invalided out of service. Marines never knew where or when they would fight next, but they knew they would have to take another obscure island, knowing that buddies would be wounded or killed. They were briefed on the code names of operations. This time, it was Operation Detachment. The target was Island X, and they were warned that this campaign would be rougher than a corncob, as one colonel put it. Only just before D-Day, while aboard transports en route to the beachhead, would they learn the identity of the objective and its location. On Maui, the lush and mountainous island 75 miles southeast of Honolulu, the 4th Division got the word, saddle up and move out. The same orders went to the 5th Division on Hawaii, the Big Island, the same distance beyond Maui. The 3rd Division, 3,200 nautical miles away on Guam, was alerted to wind up training and embark by the first week in February. Veteran Old Salts sensed that the next operation would be a real bloodbath. The rigorousness of training always became back-breakingly strenuous as another campaign neared, which was a clue. Troops were pushed harder than ever before in field problems, with flamethrower teams and demolition men training every day on each island. They scrambled up steep slopes, rehearsing frontal attacks against mock pillboxes and bunkers. They trained under live fire from artillery, mortars, and machine guns, with Marine dive bombers adding further realism to the exercises. 30-mile forced marches with full combat packs and weapons added stamina to men already in top shape. It was a dawn-to-dusk schedule that sometimes continued through the night, tailored to harden and hone them for Iwo Jima's treacherous terrain and defenses. Battalions and regiments blessed with heavy contingents of seasoned veterans were at peak efficiency. However, each division embarked for Iwo Jima with 2,650 replacements, men who had been overseas only a few weeks. With them, it was a different and worrisome matter. 250 were new second lieutenants fresh from platoon leaders' school at Quantico, Virginia. The troops were recruits straight from boot camp with little advanced combat training or older Marines from desk jobs at stateside posts. 8,000 men facing their first battle generated deep concern from General Smith down to the platoon level. Many replacements were less than a year from civilian life, some bitter, angry, and confused over being drafted into the Marine Corps, believing that being in the Army or Navy offered a better chance of survival. Many had wives and children, and were in their late 20s or early 30s. Old men from Marines Combat cram courses were given to the replacements before boarding ship, but it was a tragically futile experience. It was hoped that they could work in relatively safe shore parties, unloading cargo. Still, from the first hour of the invasion, losses were so heavy that the new men were immediately flung into savage fighting, where their lack of combat knowledge made many of them instant casualties. Countless numbers were hit before learning the name of their nearest comrade, much less that of their commanding officer. On Christmas Day, vanguard elements of the 5th Division boarded the attack transport ships. Many of the 27,500 residents of Hilo, the capital of the island of Hawaii, watched and cheered as the troops marched to the docks. The Big Island was proud of its Marine Division and hoped it would return soon, with most of the men safe. On Christmas Eve, they and the 4th Division on Maui had dined in scrumptious style, feeding the lambs and sending them to slaughter, said a sardonic old-timer. Troops far-sighted enough to hoard beer from skint rations of 4 bottles a month used it to cap celebrations. Grapefruit or pineapple juice laced with sick bay medicinal alcohol packed a wallop of Christmas cheer for a lucky few who had friends among Navy corpsmen and doctors. Chapels were crowded for midnight services, but many men just took it easy. The 3rd Division also had its Christmas spread, but more training lay ahead for its troops. Since they were 1,500 miles nearer to Iwo Jima, they would not embark for another 5 weeks. On December 27, the 4th Division came down from Camp Maui, 1,500 feet up Haleakala, the world's largest active volcano. A fortunate handful from the division had liberty in Honolulu when 5 transports put in at Pearl Harbor to load more ammunition. Streets were jammed with servicemen and civilians, bars jumped with loud chatter and jarring jukeboxes, and were wall-to-wall with people paying sky-high prices for drinks. In every saloon there were at least 10 men to every woman. Unless you arrived early or waited in a long line, you could not squeeze into the packed USO or YMCA. Overpriced hamburgers and hot dogs quickly sold out at lunchrooms, and seats were filled in every movie house. Even if liberty meant nothing more than walking the narrow streets, watching people, and seeing flashing neon signs, it was good to experience civilization. Many would never see it again. Before weighing anchor for the rendezvous area off Saipan, the 4th and 5th Division attack troops made final rehearsal landings on Maui's southeast coast and on Kahului, the smallest island in the Hawaiian chain but 5 times larger than Iwo Jima. Like most dry runs, the exercises were chaotic. Several transports ran into bad weather and did not arrive in time to send landing craft to the beaches. Ubiquitous amphibian trucks, officially designated as Ducos and universally known as ducks because of their ability to operate at sea and ashore, were not put in the water. It was deemed unwise to expose their cargoes of ammunition to saltwater corrosion. Offshore reefs and choppy waves scuttled plans to land tanks and artillery. The brass was not overly distressed. Like people in show business, they believed in the axiom that a poor dress rehearsal means a good opening. It had happened that way in the past, and all hands hoped it would hold true at Iwo Jima. By the first week in January, 4th and 5th Division ships had vanished from the islands. It would be 40 days before Marines aboard them would feel land under their feet again. Then it would be the tortuous black sands of Iwo Jima, with the island shaking and roaring from explosions caused by General Kurabayashi's big guns and heavy mortars. As the Marines finished training and headed for Iwo, the Japanese worked night and day to make the island even more impregnable. However, it was already feeling the might of American naval and air power. On December 8, the island was blasted by the heaviest air attack so far in the Pacific War, when 212 heavy bombers and long-range fighters plastered Chidori Airfield and heavy naval gun emplacements. All returned to the Marianas without loss, while the Japanese lost 6 interceptors. Navy cruisers delivered an unwelcome package the following day. 4 cruisers moved to within a mile of shore to unload 2,000 rounds of 8-inch shells. The enemy responded on Christmas night with a 6-plane bomber strike against Saipan, eluding the island's radar and destroying 4 B-29s while damaging another 11. Navy cruisers returned to Iwo on December 27, firing another 1,200 rounds of 8-inch shells and sinking 2 small freighters near shore. This time there was no retaliation against Saipan, and enemy planes would never again hit the Marianas. The battle for Iwo Jima had begun, and there would be no let-up until the island was invaded and conquered. Beginning with the December 8 attack by B-29 superfortresses and B-24 Liberators, The island was pummeled for 72 consecutive days by aerial bombardment or sporadic but heavy naval shelling from close offshore positions. During the first 11 days of January, Army bombers hammered Iwo Jima in daylight with 15,000 tons of explosives. The brand new battleship Indiana appeared off the island for the first time on January 25, firing 1,316-inch shells into it in daylight salvos. The same day, 4 cruisers slammed another 1,308-inch rounds into the shuddering target, sweeping the beaches and Chidori airfield from end to end. Air photos showed nearly 5,000 craters on 1 square mile of rubble-strewn terrain. Attacks continued daily from the sea or air until troops hit the beaches on H hour of February 19. But to what ultimate result? General Smith said the airstrikes and naval shelling were virtually meaningless and minced no words in his critique. All this added up to a terrific total of destructive effort, which the uninitiated might expect to blast any island off the military map, level every defense no matter how strong, and wipe out the garrison, he wrote in his memoirs. But nothing of the kind happened. Like the worm which becomes stronger the more you cut it up, Iwo Jima thrived on our heavy shelling. The airfields were kept inactive by our attacks, and some installations were destroyed, but the main body of defenses not only remained physically intact, but strengthened markedly. As General Kuribayashi braced for the inevitable, Admiral Nimitz moved his headquarters and staff to Guam. Although Guam had become a powerful base, it was still in the war zone. Nimitz wanted to be nearer the action to maintain tight control over the steamrolling events about to unfold at Iwo Jima and the subsequent operations planned for Japan's downfall. Nimitz again lived atop a commanding hill with a view, this time overlooking the teeming harbor of Agana, the island's capital. His quarters were not as plush as those at Makalapa but were more than adequate. He had a low-lying clapboard house with 4 bedrooms and 4 baths opening onto a courtyard facing Tokyo, landscaped with Kentucky bluegrass and flower beds. The combination living and dining room in which the Admiral entertained nightly was 25 by 35 feet. In contrast, Howling Mad Smith and other visiting Marine brass were quartered in 2-deck Quonset huts farther down Nimitz's Hill, known as Commander-in-Chief Pacific Hill, where the inhabitants at the top were still called the Monks of Makalapa. 12 miles across the island, the 3rd Division had its base camp in a coconut grove above crescent-shaped Ilig Bay, a magnificent and picturesque inlet with a fine beach. The days were hot, but nights were comfortably cool and mosquito-free, welcome changes from the insufferable earlier tent camps in the South Pacific. General Erskine had commanded the division's 21,000 men since their conquest of Guam. At 46, he was the youngest 2-star general in the Marine Corps. As a teenage company bugler from Columbia, Louisiana, he had served in the Army on the Mexican border before earning 2nd lieutenant bars and shipping overseas as a Marine in World War I. Twice wounded, he wore 11 decorations from the United States and France by the time the armistice was signed, awards for valor in the battles of Château-Thierry, Belleau Wood, Soissons, and Saint-Mihiel. When out of earshot, officers and men called Erskine the Big E. He was aware of the sobriquet and proud of it, but not when, in black humor, they referred to him as Graves Registration Erskine for his role as Howling Mad Smith's chief of staff in the battles of Tarawa, Saipan, and Tinian. The nickname the Big E came not entirely from his physique, although he was just under 6 feet tall and solidly muscular, but from his strong will, tough discipline, fairness, and the solid respect he commanded from his troops and officers. He was ruggedly handsome, soft-spoken most of the time, but could curse with the best. His pale blue eyes flashed with a cold glint when angry, but his smile was gentle and disarming. Captain Lewis Hayward, a movie actor who joined the Corps after starring in a film about leathernecks, once said of Erskine, "He looks like what Central Casting in Hollywood tries to find when they need the ideal Marine general for a film." To General Smith and other friends, he was Bobby Erskine for reasons no one seemed to know. Erskine was General Smith's stalwart right-hand protégé and confidant before taking command of the 3rd Division. Together, they had trained the men, planned, and ramrodded landings from the bitter cold of the Aleutians to the torrid heat of the South and Central Pacific. Because of the hectic and often turbulent days as Smith's shaker and mover, Erskine had a keen insight into how the old man thought and what he expected of the Marines at Iwo Jima, possibly more so than did Rocky Gates. In the battle plan, the 3rd Division was the floating reserve. It would be 80 miles at sea on D-Day, ready to land if called. Iwo Jima's beaches were too small to take 3 divisions abreast in the attack, and the landing zones would be jammed with men and equipment as it was. There was an outside chance that the 3rd Division would not be needed at all, and that the 4th and 5th Divisions could take the island with their 42,000-plus men. When the first casualty reports came from the beachhead, that pipe dream vanished. Nearly 500 ships were anchored off Saipan by the second week in February. From shore to horizon of Magician Bay, vessels of every size and description waited to sail the last 600 miles to Iwo Jima. Nearly 100 were attack transports and landing ship tanks carrying the men and their combat gear for the assault. Others were supply ships camouflaged in weird zigzag stripes of gray. They arrived at the staging area singly, in 2s and 3s, and in small, unescorted convoys. Some sailed from West Coast commissioning shakedown cruises with little danger from submarines or rampaging warships. What was left of the enemy fleet was hemmed in protecting the home islands. Missing from the armada were battleships and heavy aircraft carriers. They were steaming off Japan with screening cruisers and destroyers in the war's heaviest naval foray so far, a mighty sweep against Honshu Island to unleash thousands of 2-ton shells and launch hundreds of bombing and strafing airstrikes against enemy targets. But much of everything else in the fleet was there. Communication ships bristling with radio equipment and carrying the generals and admirals commanding the invasion, landing ship tanks with their loads of tanks, amphibious tractors and troops, and extensive damage to Japanese industrial infrastructure. The success of this attack was a significant morale booster for the American forces as they prepared for the battle ahead. On February 18th, the weather cleared, giving Admiral Blandy's bombardment group another opportunity to strike Iwo Jima. Early in the morning, the battleships resumed their bombardment, with air support from carrier-based planes. The weather was now cooperating, allowing for more precise targeting and continuous shelling throughout the day. Despite the intense bombardment, General Kurobayashi and his forces remained entrenched. They had prepared for such an onslaught, using the island's natural terrain and extensive tunnel networks to shield themselves from the American firepower. The Japanese defenses, composed of fortified bunkers, artillery positions, and pillboxes, were designed to inflict maximum casualties on the invading forces. The Marines aboard the transport ship spent their final hours before the invasion checking their equipment and writing letters home. There was a sense of grim determination among them. They knew the battle would be brutal. At dawn on February 19th, the invasion force reached its final staging area. The ships moved into position, and the landing craft were lowered into the water. At 8:59 a.m., the first wave of Marines hit the beaches of Iwo Jima. The initial landings met little resistance, as the Japanese had held their fire, allowing the beaches to become crowded with men and equipment. But as the second wave approached, the Japanese unleashed their fury. Artillery, mortars, and machine guns opened up from well-concealed positions, creating a deadly crossfire that pinned down the Marines on the open sand. The black volcanic ash of Iwo Jima made movement difficult, and the beach quickly became a chaotic scene of smoke, explosions, and desperate fighting. Despite the intense resistance, the Marines pressed forward, securing a foothold on the island. The battle for Iwo Jima had begun in earnest, and it would be one of the bloodiest and most hard-fought battles in the Pacific War. As the days passed, the Marines inched their way forward, yard by yard, against a determined and fanatical enemy. The Japanese defenders, led by General Kurobayashi, fought with a tenacity that shocked the American forces. The battle raged on, with fierce close-quarters combat and relentless bombardment from both sides. By the end of the first week, the Marines had made significant progress, capturing several key positions, including Mount Suribachi, where the iconic flag raising would later take place. However, the fight was far from over. The Japanese continued to resist fiercely from their network of tunnels and bunkers, turning every advance into a costly and bloody affair. The capture of Iwo Jima was vital for the United States, as it provided a base for fighter escorts and emergency landings for bombers attacking Japan. The bravery and sacrifice of the Marines on Iwo Jima would be remembered as a testament to their determination and the strategic importance of the island in the Pacific theater of World War II. Thousands of sailors from ships offshore scanned the incredible scene with disbelief. The intensity of the bombardment was overwhelming, and yet the Japanese defenses seemed resilient. It was as if the island itself was fighting back, with explosions and gunfire lighting up the skies and waves. The morning of February 19, 1945, dawned with anticipation and dread. At 6:30 a.m., the bombardment intensified, with every available gun and aircraft targeting the beaches and known enemy positions. The objective was to soften the Japanese defenses as much as possible before the Marines hit the beaches. The plan was meticulous, the coordination precise, but the outcome was still uncertain. As the landing craft approached the shore, the Marines prepared themselves for the worst. Many had experienced previous battles and knew what to expect, but the unique challenges of Iwo Jima were daunting. The black volcanic sand made movement difficult, and the well-fortified Japanese positions promised a brutal fight. At 8:59 a.m., the first wave of Marines landed on the beaches. Initially, there was an eerie silence. The Japanese held their fire, allowing the beaches to fill with men and equipment. But this silence was deceptive. Moments later, the defenders unleashed a torrent of gunfire and artillery, turning the beaches into a deadly gauntlet. Despite the fierce resistance, the Marines pushed forward. The first objective was to secure the beachhead and then advance inland. The terrain, a mix of treacherous volcanic ash and rugged cliffs, made every step a struggle. The Japanese, entrenched in a network of tunnels and bunkers, used their positions to inflict maximum damage. Throughout the day, the Marines fought their way forward, inch by inch. The cost was high, with casualties mounting rapidly. The black sand of Iwo Jima was stained with the blood of the fallen. Yet the determination and bravery of the Marines were unyielding. They knew the importance of their mission and were prepared to pay the price. By nightfall, the beachhead was secure, and the Marines had established a tenuous foothold on the island. The battle for Iwo Jima was far from over, but the initial landings had succeeded. The struggle would continue for weeks, with the Marines facing relentless counterattacks and entrenched defenses. Every yard gained was paid for in blood, but the momentum was now in their favor. As the days turned into weeks, the intensity of the battle did not wane. The Japanese fought with a ferocity and determination that was both feared and respected by the Marines. General Kurebayashi's strategy of defense in depth ensured that every advance was costly. The network of tunnels and hidden positions made it nearly impossible to dislodge the defenders without sustaining heavy casualties. Mount Suribachi, the volcanic peak that dominated the island's southern end, became a critical objective. Its capture was essential for controlling the island and providing a vantage point for the Marines. On February 23, after days of relentless fighting, the Marines reached the summit and raised the American flag. This iconic moment, captured in the famous photograph by Joe Rosenthal, became a symbol of hope and determination. Despite this victory, the battle raged on. The northern part of the island was a labyrinth of defenses, and the Japanese continued to resist fiercely. It took until March 26 for the island to be declared secure. The cost was staggering, with nearly 7,000 Marines killed and over 19,000 wounded. Japanese casualties were even higher, with the majority of the 21,000 defenders killed and only a few hundred taken prisoner. The capture of Iwo Jima provided a critical base for the Allied forces, allowing for fighter escorts and emergency landings for bombers targeting Japan. The bravery and sacrifice of the Marines on Iwo Jima stand as a testament to their dedication and the strategic importance of the island in the Pacific theater of World War II. The battle's legacy endures, remembered for its intensity, the heroism of those who fought, and the profound impact it had on the course of the war. The naval bombardment on D-Day-2 was both a display of overwhelming firepower and a harsh lesson in the resilience of the Japanese defenses on Iwo Jima. Giant orange fireballs erupted from the island, creating geysers of black sand and rubble. Heavy gray smoke obscured much of the island, but despite the intense shelling, only a few shells splashed harmlessly among the battleships. The cruiser Pensacola and the minesweepers were, so far, unmolested. General Kurebayashi, watching from his headquarters in the high ground north of the airstrip, faced a critical decision. Was this a feint or the real thing? He chose to hold his concealed gun emplacements in reserve, certain that American reconnaissance planes had not spotted them all. However, when he concluded that the invasion had indeed begun, he ordered his gunners to open fire, signaling the start of a fierce and costly battle for the Americans. As the American gunboats and their crews, including 102 Navy and Marine frogmen from underwater demolition teams, approached the shore, they were met with an avalanche of shelling. The Japanese coastal defense guns, artillery, rockets, and mortars turned the beach into a deadly zone. In 90 minutes, every vessel in the tiny armada was hit, with some more than a dozen times. The gunboats suffered severe casualties and damage, with 43 crewmen killed and 153 wounded. Frantic radio calls from the gunboats underscored the chaos and destruction. Lieutenant Junior Grade Rufus H. Herring, the 25-year-old North Carolinian commanding one of the gunboats, displayed extraordinary bravery. Despite being severely wounded, he managed to steer his stricken craft to safety. His actions would later earn him the Congressional Medal of Honor. Meanwhile, the underwater demolition teams swam toward shore, facing torrents of enemy fire. Despite the perilous conditions, they completed their mission, confirming that the bottom was clear of obstructions up to the shoreline, but noting that the surf was nearly 6 feet high. This would make it difficult for landing craft to stay on the beaches when the main invasion force arrived. The efforts of the underwater demolition teams, while successful in their objectives, highlighted the immense bravery of the unarmed sailors and Marines. They faced icy waters and a deluge of enemy fire, yet proceeded with their tasks with remarkable determination. The cruiser Pensacola provided constant covering fire but was heavily damaged by enemy artillery. Commander Austin C. Bain, the executive officer, and 16 other men were killed, with another 127 wounded. The ship's damage control teams managed to keep her afloat and out of range. The intensity of the pre-invasion bombardment and the fierce Japanese response underscored the challenges that lay ahead. Despite the American firepower, the Japanese defenses remained largely intact. Only 3 of 20 known blockhouses were knocked out, and many other fortified positions were untouched. General Kuribayashi's defenders had inflicted significant damage on the American forces, demonstrating their readiness and resilience. As the ships moved over the horizon for the night, air photos revealed the extent of the Japanese defenses that remained unscathed. Admiral Blandy's ships had unleashed an unprecedented barrage, but the day's fighting heavily favored Kuribayashi's forces. The naval bombardment, while spectacular, had not significantly weakened the Japanese defenses. The stage was set for a brutal and costly battle when the Marines would hit the beaches in less than 36 hours. General Kuribayashi radioed Imperial Army headquarters in Tokyo, reporting that the Americans' first attempt to invade had been repelled. Praise and encouragement from Admiral Sei, Commander-in-Chief of the combined Japanese fleet, bolstered the defenders' morale. They were determined to hold Iwo Jima at any cost, preparing for the next wave of the American assault. D-Day-2 had been a harsh introduction to the realities of the Iwo Jima campaign. The resilience of the Japanese defenses and the heavy losses suffered by the American forces foreshadowed the brutal battle that was to come. As the ships regrouped and prepared for the main invasion, the Marines and sailors knew they were in for a fight that would test their resolve and determination to the utmost. The night before the invasion, Vice Admiral Blandy and his staff, troubled by the limited success of their bombardments, examined the latest reconnaissance photos. Determined to adapt their tactics, they decided to bring battleships and cruisers closer to the shore. This would allow them to saturate the beaches, terraces, airstrip, and Mount Suribachi with intense shelling, hoping to neutralize the Japanese defenses before the Marines landed. Lieutenant Colonel Donald M. Weller, the Marine gunfire officer on Blandy's staff, supported this aggressive plan but suggested postponing D-Day by 24 hours to allow for additional bombardment. Despite this recommendation and the option given by Admiral Spruance to extend the pre-invasion shelling, Blandy decided against the delay, fearing worsening weather could jeopardize the entire operation. The decision was made, and at 7:45 a.m. on D-Day-1, Blandy ordered the battleships to close in and commence firing. For the next 5 hours, the Tennessee, Idaho, New York, and Nevada relentlessly bombarded the cliffs, quarries, and terraces above the beaches. Their goal was to silence the coastal guns, naval rifles, and artillery positioned on the island. Cruisers, destroyers, and rocket-firing gunboats joined the effort, laying down non-stop barrages throughout the day. However, weather continued to be a hindrance. Frequent rain squalls hampered visibility, limiting airstrikes and reducing the effectiveness of carrier planes and B-24 bombers. When the naval bombardment ceased at 6:21 p.m., reconnaissance photos revealed only marginal improvements in the Japanese defenses. While some blockhouses and coastal guns had been destroyed, many fortified positions remained untouched. As night fell, the seascape around Iwo Jima appeared eerily calm, with no ships in sight. General Kuribayashi knew the Americans would return the next morning with another powerful show of force, and he prepared his defenses accordingly. Blandy, looking at the latest photos, signaled to Kelly Turner that despite the incomplete destruction of enemy installations, he believed the landing could proceed as scheduled. Marine troops aboard the attack transports and landing ships, unaware of the decision against the additional day of bombardment, prepared for the assault. Chaplains held church services, and men wrote letters home, checked their gear, and mentally braced themselves for the ordeal ahead. Conversations about the relative hardships of life as sailors versus Marines filled the compartments, but all knew the next day would bring a shared and brutal experience. Scattered among the invasion fleet were the frogmen whose mission had triggered General Kuribayashi's initial reaction. After completing their tasks, they waited for transportation back to the Marianas. Tragically, a kamikaze attack on the attack transport Blessman resulted in the deaths of 2 frogmen and 20 wounded, along with 11 ship crew members. That night, aboard the U.S. Eldorado, Lieutenant General Holland Smith read aloud a prayer from a small blue card given by the ship's chaplain, invoking divine support for the battle to come. As dawn approached on D-Day, a soft breeze rippled the turquoise sea, and the sky began to brighten. The stage was set for one of the most fiercely contested battles of the Pacific War. The Marines would soon storm the beaches of Iwo Jima, facing an enemy well prepared and determined to defend their position to the last man.